there's a common theme in the scriptures that the way that the Lord humbles us is by pouring such generous, forgiving mercy upon us in such a way that we recognize how we've treated him, and we crumble at his feet, saying, how can you be so merciful? And there's a healing that happens in that. I think one of the beautiful depiction of this, even in cinematography, is in the movie The Mission. I don't know if you've ever seen that one. It was back in the 80s. Robert De Niro starred in that one and some others, but it's worth seeing sometime if you haven't seen it. It really depicts actually rather well some of the struggles that was going on in some of the early missionary efforts in South America. But in that story, you have this man who, in an act of rage and vengeance, kills another person. He's a sword fighter, and he has a duel, and he kills the other person. So he's in prison, and he goes to confession. And the Jesuit priest that's there gives him a penance which is quite intense. He is to take all of his armor, all of his weaponry, all of this stuff that he took pride in and ultimately led to the death of someone else, and he's to carry it on his back. And he's to climb up a waterfall in the area, the borderland of Argentina and Paraguay and Brazil. There is a huge falls there called Iguazu Falls, which is actually bigger than Niagara Falls, if you can believe that. And that's where the filming takes place, but he's to climb up this, like on the side of this waterfall, and he's slipping, and it's dangerous, and he's getting bruised, but he just keeps going. And he finally gets to the top, to the area where he was also known as a slave trader. He was someone who was vicious against the the native people that were there. And so that's another one of his crimes, is that he would capture them, he would enslave them. And so this Jesuit priest was sending this person there, carrying the stuff that led him to this horrible murder, but then also leading him to the people that he was also destroying through slavery. And he gets up there, and he's exhausted, and all of the natives of the area start gathering around him with spears, and it seems like they're ready to kill him. But then they go and they cut his bonds, because he was carrying all of this also with his hands bound, like struggling up this waterfall. And he realizes that he enslaved them, but they freed him. And he starts to break down, he starts to weep. And there's a transformation that happens in his heart. And I remember spiritual directors telling me that was probably the most powerful depiction of what penance is ultimately called to do within our lives. And that's an intense one. A lot of times we 3 Hail Marys, but climb up a waterfall and all this, but it's for that particular person, that was to help them discover who they had been and how they had mistreated others, but then they were so mercifully treated. And they discovered the mercy of God in the midst of that. So today, in the book of Ezra, you have this priest scribe, Ezra. This is the time when the people have, because of their sins, their nation was broken. The walls of Jerusalem were torn down. The temple was destroyed. They were carried off by Babylon. But then Babylon was conquered, and the kings of Persia took over where the people of Israel were now in exile. And Cyrus, the king of Persia, was inspired by the Lord to have the people go back home to rebuild their walls. And so that's what's happening. They're going back. And Ezra, I believe this is the time of, they've already started to rebuild the temple. They're having this evening sacrifice. They're getting back to everything that they thought was completely gone. And Ezra says he rises from his wretchedness. His cloak and mantle are torn. He just falls on his knees. He stretches out his hands to the Lord. And he says these words. He's like, God, I am just too ashamed and confounded to raise my face to you. So he's ashamed at what he's done. Think of that man, the Robert De Niro character, who started to become ashamed and he broke down in tears because of what he did. But he's confounded because how God treated him. The Robert De Niro character is confounded because how the natives who had enslaved, that he had enslaved, were actually treating him and giving him freedom. So he has this experience of being ashamed and confounded. Ashamed because I am a sinner, but confounded because God loves me so radically that he died for me. And ultimately, Ezra wouldn't know the depth of this, but he's feeling that reality of who God is. The God who brings us back home. The God who hasn't forgotten us. And who brings us back and says, go, become part of the covenant again, because I haven't forgotten my side of that covenant. And he goes on saying, we deserve all of this. Our guilt reaches up to heaven. It's piled up. Our wicked deeds are piled up over our heads so much that it goes up to heaven. You can think of the Tower of Babel there. He says, all of this has been happening. And because of that, we suffered justly by having our city broken, being sent away into exile, being a disgrace, all these things. But he says, and now a short time ago, mercy came to us from the Lord, who left us a remnant, who protected his people, and gave us a stake in his holy place. In other words, he brought us back to the Holy Land. And God has now brightened our eyes and given us relief from being slaves before. For slaves we are, but in our servitude God did not abandon us. Rather, he even moved the heart of this pagan king, Cyrus, the king of Persia, to move his heart to help us get back home. That's how powerful God was working there in such an unexpected way. Taking this king who was kind of a villain, and yet moving his heart to bring the people back home. To raise again the house of our God, to restore its ruins, to give us a fence. In other words, to give us walls and protection over our nation again. It's so beautiful to see. He's just overwhelmed with unbelievable, overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. That God would do this for him and for his people. He's speaking on behalf of his people. So he's not just saying, well, me and everyone else, whatever. He's speaking with this voice of saying, God, you've done this for all of us, and we don't deserve any of it. And that's what we need to rediscover within our lives. That's the message of the gospel. That's what we call the kerygma, which is that we were created, but then we were captured. We were redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. And we now respond with such gratitude to the never-ending, reckless love of God. And again, Ezra would not have known the depth. I mean, he was so moved, but think about the depth of what Jesus would show us about the reckless love of God in this image of the cross. Have we allowed the cross to become numb within our hearts? Have we come into Mass, come to this holy sacrifice, the evening sacrifice, the morning sacrifice here? And are we like Ezra, falling on our knees saying, Lord, I don't deserve any of this. And yet you still came to me. You still loved me unto death. Let's ask the Lord for that grace to rediscover that original message of the gospel. That's one of the reasons why we have something like Alpha. It's the beginning, but we always have to go back to the beginning in order to discover afresh, God loves me, and I don't deserve any of it. And yet he made me right in the blood of the Lamb. And all he says to me is, trust me. Return the love that I pour out to you. All I'm asking is that you love me back. So I encourage you, we're getting ready for the Alpha course next week. Really pray about this. It's going to be online. You can do it in the comfort of your home. But this is what we're talking about. We're talking about discovering not just here, because yes, we know that, Jesus died for my sins. He rose and now I'm free. We know that here, but have we really let it go here so that we're like Ezra? We're falling on our knees. We're filled with such emotion in our heart of saying, God, why? Why did you do this for me? When I spat upon you, when I took the flagellum in my hands and I whipped you mercilessly, why did you turn to me and open your heart so that I could be healed? I don't understand it. Why? And the response that you'll hear, because I love you. Bottom line.